Hi, I'm Cheryl Kagan, very proud to be the senator for Gaithersburg and Rockville. Welcome to this week's very special edition of Kibbitzing with Kagan. During this Women's History Month, I wanted to pick some of the women I most admire, and my special guest today is Ann Lewis. Ann, thank you so much for joining me and for all you've done throughout your career.
Thank you. I'm thrilled to be here.
Thank you. Uh, we have so much to cover, and I'm not supposed to make 3-hour podcasts, so we'll have to just get started. You were political from a very young age. Apparently, at age 6, you were already aware. Did you come from a political family? What inspired you at that young of an age to be focused on the political world?
I was very lucky. My parents took government seriously. I don't know that they thought of politics, but they knew that who governed mattered in their lives, in our lives. So they would talk about it. And I listened. And I came away understanding. Now we're in Bayonne, New Jersey, Hudson County, a long time ago. The idea that politics was open to the public, not so. Little different set of rules. But I listened to the ideas that they were talking about and understood there are people who get elected. They make the rules that everybody lives by.
Yep,
Yeah. Pretty soon I
amazing.
figured out, wait a minute, I can do that at least as well as anybody I know. And I
Amen.
gotta say, Cheryl, it's been a while since I was listening to my parents, but I still think so.
That's fantastic. Now, you started at Radcliffe,
Yes.
so feminist, all women's campus, and yet you left to follow your husband, who was in the army. Talk about that journey.
Again, oh, wow. Now you're asking me something I haven't thought about for a long time. But understand that at the time, that's what you did. You got
Right.
married and you had children. And by the time I turned around, there I was, married with children. I was going back to school. There were people who did it. I thought it was kind of superhuman at the time, but
Mm,
I admire women who, with young children, go back to college. I just wasn't that good at multitasking, I guess. So
right.
the other part, all right, I'm going to be very honest here. I realized when I didn't have classes, I could just read whatever I wanted, whenever I wanted. And I didn't want to give that up. So I just, perhaps I'm self educated at this point. There's been a lot of reading.
Well, you've been educated in life, not just in the books. So when you and I first met, or when I first met you, you were the Ann Lewis. You were the first woman political director of the Democratic National Committee, which was a big damn deal. And again, the first woman. Talk about what got you to that place. You had worked for Barbara Mikulski, run her first race, all that. But talk about how important representation has been in that job and in your career.
I'm going to go back and say again, good fortune, because I was around at the time of the second wave of the women's movement.
Yep.
So I go to this meeting and
Why
I,
don't you define what the first wave was and then what the second wave
oh,
was?
good point. Okay. If the first wave was Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, Ida Wells, the wonderful, brave, smart Carrie Cat women who won the right to vote, right?
Yes.
Now we have the right to vote. And for some people, okay, we got other things going on. But comes again, middle of the 20th century now, 1970 perhaps, we're going to say, there's more to do. And so this second wave comes along, and here you're thinking names like Betty Friedan, Gloria Steinem, Bella Abzug, again,
Mm.
Shirley Chisholm, a whole new set of women leaders, yes. Um, as I say, I was lucky enough to, not quite stumble, but show up at a meeting. I heard these women talking about there was something wrong with the political system if women couldn't be leaders. Now, the women, how do you get to what we're all for, right? Equality, opportunity through a system that keeps some people out. So I'm a Democrat, I'm a liberal. I believe in politics as a way to make a better world. And I know we can do that when everybody's included.
So why don't you sorry.
No, I go home, start organizing the Massachusetts Women's Political Caucus, go on from there, meet lots of very smart, admirable women who become friends, including a city councilwoman from Baltimore, Maryland, named Barbara Mikulski. They're friends to this day. And we grow because there is now this network of women who support one another, who look at opportunities and say, well, wait a minute, isn't there a woman who could do that?
So let's pause for a second. First off, I assume that basically everybody who's watching this would know who Barbara Mikulski is, but not everyone would. She was but started off as a feisty council member, Baltimore City Council. With your help, she was elected to the U.S. Congress, and then in 1986 became the first woman elected to the U.S. Senate, independent of any pre-existing husband who died or whatever. So that was a big deal. And but give a glimpse. Let's go back to that era, to the 1970s. Again, for younger women or people who may not know the history, give a couple of examples of what women couldn't do. So we couldn't get credit cards in our own name. We couldn't, give a couple of examples like that women today just would be astonished by.
That's right. You would sit in meetings, and again, if you walk into the typical political headquarters in those days, you would see a lot of women in front. And the women were making phone calls, and the women were writing, and they were typing.
Stuffing envelopes.
Yes. And if you kept walking and walking, you'd get into the back rooms, and that's where the guys were.
Sure.
And they were on the phone talking to one another. And you think, wait a minute, again, there is something missing here.
Yes.
And you've got to start. And so you realize once you get that in your head, you see it everywhere you go.
Right.
So you're right. There were laws. There were employment pages, jobs pages that said for women and for men. I don't have to tell you that they were very different kinds of jobs.
Yes.
And somehow the ones for men paid better.
Paid better. Right. Of course.
Right? There were, in so many ways, we were sex segregated, always in ways in which women were diminished.
Yes.
So little by little, you start taking those on. There were restaurants and bars that women could not go. You didn't sit in I was then living in Boston. You didn't go to the bar and lockovers, as I recall. Women did not go.
So you were already active in politics and successful in politics when the Supreme Court issued its Roe versus Wade decision to legalize abortion. And you've continued to stay active through the Supreme Court Dobbs decision after 50 years overthrowing women's reproductive choice. Give us a sense of that trajectory, that journey. And I'm wearing my Bands Off Our Bodies button. I don't know if there's going to be a reflection, but it makes me crazy. You've been there, you watched the whole thing.
Let me say first, I really like that button.
Yes, me too.
Yes, I was living in Boston when a Dr. Kenneth Evelyn was prosecuted for assisting in performing being part of an abortion. And so I remember those days. And by the way, in Boston at that time, another guy was also prosecuted for giving out birth control. So we should never forget that when they start coming after abortion, birth control comes very soon.
Next.
This is about women's ability to make our own decisions. This is about women being in charge of our lives, and the people who are most offended and trying to shut down on abortion, they have a long agenda, and birth control is on it. So yes, I've got to say, when that happened, it seemed so natural, because we were in a period in which, again, women's lives were expanding, women's rights were expanding. It seemed, oh, of course, that was the next step. And watching the last few years, watching the way the right has weaponized around the issue of women making decisions, watching The people who now most ardently claim to be pro-life, and then you go back and look, and somehow they're in states in which they have never expanded Medicaid, right? States, the most pro-life states are also those that don't decide not to have school lunch programs in the summer. It's really remarkable how for all their talk and pictures of cuddly babies, how
Right.
badly they're prepared to treat babies once they're born.
So I'm gonna a little bit edit you here because you said pro-life. I'm gonna at least put air quotes, but certainly the pro-choice movement calls them anti-choice because everyone's for life. We all just want our own lives and our successful and happy and independent lives. I think it was your brother who said that Republicans are pro-life. They support. Oh, I'm going to get it wrong. I haven't thought about this for forever, but they're for life from conception until birth. And as soon as a baby is born, they have no interest in feeding it, clothing it, housing it,
That,
educating it.
that is exactly right. That their definition of life. So when I
Right.
use pro-life, I usually do it with air quotes, but yes,
Yes.
because I want people to hear the hypocrisy of
Yes.
claiming to be pro-life, but you won't allow a summer lunch program. And we just had a couple of states within the last 2 months say, no, we're not going to take that money for summer to feed kids.
Yes.
So,
Yes.
but the other message I do want to get through is no victory is permanent.
Yes.
We had won. We thought it was over. I remember in Hillary Clinton's presidential campaign talking about what was at stake in the Supreme Court,
Mhm.
and people did not take it nearly as seriously as they should have. You have
Agreed.
to be prepared to keep fighting.
Right. So when I worked at National NARAL, the National Abortion Rights Action League, in the mid 80s, we were worried and all the threats and the teeny tiny incursions into our reproductive choice. I'm not sure we could have envisioned the complete overturning. And yeah, there's so much to cover. I because I referenced your brother, and this podcast is about you, but I should define who your brother is, and let's take a quick detour if that's okay.
Of course, I'm
Um,
always happy to talk about my family.
Okay, so Ann Lewis's brother is Barney Frank, who served brilliantly in Congress and was one of the most pithy, effective, funny members of Congress ever. And he was openly gay at some point in his tenure. And again, back then, that was not as common, not as accepted. Do you want to talk briefly about Barney and his tenure and the challenges?
Well, I'm enormously proud of Barney, and I will only add it, he is my younger brother by 2 years.
Yes.
So
Yes.
I took that kid to kindergarten. You will understand that I've always felt morally responsible for him.
Mhm.
But yes, he gets elected. He's been in the state legislature.
Right.
Then in 1980, he he's actually thinking of retiring from the state legislature, and the congressional seat is held by Father Robert Drinan, who
Yep.
was another remarkable individual,
Yes.
um, a Catholic priest, and again, a moral force in Congress.
Yes.
Drinan is told by the Vatican that he cannot run for reelection. Father Drinan was also pro-choice.
Hmm.
So that was it. That was going too far. And there was an open congressional seat. Barney runs and wins. It is now 1980. It is, again, enormously exciting. No,
Yes.
he is not openly gay at that point.
Right.
That is not a time when you could, for the first time, you could not introduce yourself
Hmm.
as being gay. But
Hmm.
after years in Congress, when people knew him, um, when they saw how well and how he worked and how effective he was, um,
Yes.
Barney came out, honestly, said who he was. And while the next election was a tough one, um,
Yes.
he succeeded. And I'm very, when we look at how a country has grown,
Yes.
we have people running for office these days who can tell us who they are, and we're
Yep.
all better off for it.
Including one of my delegates who is now running for Congress.
Yes.
So very exciting. So since you mentioned Father Drinan, and we've talked a little bit about Barney Frank and you and me. The common denominator among the four of us is ADA, Americans for Democratic Action. And so, why don't we talk? You were the national director for a while. Barney was president, so was Father Drinan. I was on the board for about a billion years. Why don't you talk about being at the helm of a national organization, not as just political director, which is a big damn deal, but national director of a revered progressive organization, national organization.
And I just want to go back for a moment and say if there are anyone here who hasn't yet heard about ADA, it was formed, Americans for Democratic Action. If you want to talk about revered Americans, by Eleanor Roosevelt,
Eleanor Roosevelt. Yep.
Ruther, Joseph Rao,
Yep.
at a time in our country when it was really not quite clear. World War II was ending, the Cold War was beginning, just what direction Americans would go. And they said, wait a minute, we're Americans, we're proud of our liberties, we're proud of our traditions. And no, we're not, we are not going again.
Yes.
Far. So again, very, very important. I'm say, love the history, lots of labor leaders who were part of it. And so yes, I did. After I left the dance, I was then, as you had said, the first woman political director.
Yes.
And I know for people who are listening, that may seem hard to imagine that there was a time when women didn't do those things. Trust
Right.
me, it happened.
Right.
But we're well past it. And then what would I do next? And ADA was just such a natural fit because it combined everything I cared about. As you would know, it combined economics, it combined politics, it combined liberal policies. So I was very happy to be able to do that.
Yeah. We were so lucky to have you at the helm. So let's pivot. You referenced Hillary Rodham Clinton, former senator, former secretary of state, former first lady, should have been president of the United States. How heartbreaking. Talk about working on her campaign, what you were proudest of, what you think that you all and she did right, and how did Donald Trump win his first race in 2016?
There are two ways to look at how Trump won in 2016. Numerically, we're looking at a couple of 100,000 votes in the states of Michigan, right, sort of across the top, Wisconsin, a few 100,000 votes that should have gone the other way. But I remember something else too. I went to Florida for that campaign, and I was for the last get out the vote days in Florida. We were in South Florida. We were doing well in South Florida. I want to tell you that the Dade, Broward, Palm Beach counties, our coalitions, which included Jewish voters, which included Hispanic voters, and included African American voters, we were
senior citizens.
Yes,
Obviously.
numbers.
Yes.
And suddenly our field team got pulled out of the southern Florida and sent to Jacksonville, sent to northern Florida. And the word was that, again, all hell was breaking loose and the people were riding around town with Confederate flags on their cars. And it was this very different ideology, if you like. But that's what symbolized the outburst, suddenly a Trump majority. It was the politics of resentment. It was a policy get it. We want to get it back. You took it away from us somehow, and we're going to. So that is what when I think of Donald Trump, I think of those cars with Confederate flags, and I know that's some of what we have to face.
So you mean there aren't good people on both sides then, to quote Donald Trump? I mean, just
people on both sides.
fine people.
You and I know very well there was only one set of people marching. There were only one set of people with the tiki torches marching.
Yeah.
So
right.
But,
so what was the worst thing, in your opinion, that President Donald Trump did to our country? And what is your biggest fear if he were, God forbid, elected again this year in 2024?
What Donald Trump did was normalize speaking in the worst terms, to be divisive, to talk down. What he did was to take a strain, and there's always been a strain in the United States. There were know-nothings, right? There was a know-nothing
Mhm,
party in the 19th.
mhm.
We had people, yeah, we had people fighting for a Confederate flag in the 19th century. Donald Trump brought that strain back, which has been until then, while you knew it existed, we also knew that we could disapprove of it, that the majority disapproved. That isn't who we, America, we were better than that. And so when Donald Trump brought that language, that attitude, well, into the White House, he opened the door for what we're still living with today, which is
Yes.
open, racist, divisive, physical violence. And what scares me most if he got reelected was we would see even more, because the man he isn't changing. And the people who supported him then will feel affirmed that they were right.
So,
So
Tom Swaz, yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
so we have to beat him.
Yes,
Just
no
wanted to
question.
the ending.
So last month, Tom Suozzi was elected in New York's 3rd congressional district, and that was flipping a seat from the crazy liar criminal Congressman George Santos. What was the secret sauce? You were engaged, you were certainly watching, and so talk about what made the difference, and can that recipe be used in other congressional districts and Senate races to make sure that we have sane people who are elected this year?
Absolutely. So let's talk about Tom Suozzi, who had, by the way, been a county executive before, who had been a Congress before, who believed and understood that government was about making people's lives better, and that you got there by working together. So when I look at that campaign and how it was put together, for example, not nearly enough attention has gone, I think, to Grace Meng, Congresswoman Grace Meng, who represents the Queens part of the district, which is
Okay.
really Asian population. So I'd say, you know what? We win when we're in coalition. So
I
you
see.
have the Queens, this part of the district with a heavy Asian population, led by Grace Meng, who was out there working the subway stops, right? To get to people. You have a heavy Jewish population. I think it's one of the largest percentage of Jewish populations in the country. And you had, again, everybody else. It was putting that coalition together of people who want government, whose expectations for government are, what can you do? What can you do for us? And of course, this is going on at a time when the Republican Party, again, back to this highly divisive language, has picked up on immigrants are the problem.
Yes.
Immigration is the problem. And by the way, then Donald Trump says, I don't want a bill. It would be good for the Democrats, so I don't want a bill. And they pull back on the bill. So
When
here's
you
what
say the bill, you're talking about the compromise bipartisan immigration legislation that was all hammered out, all ready to go. And then he said, it's going to take this issue away from me on the campaign trail.
exactly right. And so that's the choice. On the one hand, you have, as I say, a bill that is bipartisan, that is practical. Not everybody got what they wanted, but it could have worked. And on the other hand, you have people saying, no, for political reasons, we won't do it. And that's the divide. And that's where that's how I think we win. That's when we have a majority of people saying, heck yeah, I want
Yeah,
government that makes a difference.
right. Now, the Tom Swazi demographics, though, as you said, Black, Asian, seniors, Jewish, like that is not every district and not even every swing district in our country. How do we take it back without an effective media, community, without the press, because Donald Trump has either minimized it or the economy has caused it to be weaker and shut down. How do we get the facts out there in less diverse districts so that we can win there too?
Yes, the best campaigns are those that reflect the district they're in,
Yes.
whatever that may be, right? You don't parachute into a district and win it. So you're building from the ground up. And that's where I think what's most important, and here, look, social media, whether it is Facebook or Twitter, or God help us,
Mhm.
X, excuse me, has some negative effects. But
Mhm.
what it has done, I think, is empower people who care about campaigns, who care about governing. Every one of us can be a media commentator. Every one
Yes.
of us can be a connector. We have more power than ever if we choose to use it. And so I believe that, I understand the DNC is now recommending, Democratic National Committee is now recommending something called relational campaigning. And I hadn't heard that term before. But I
Mm.
will tell you that in 2016, when I was going around the country on behalf of the Hillary Clinton campaign, I would talk in living rooms and parlor meetings and say, if a woman wants and has an important question, who does she ask? Another woman. If you want to know
Mhm.
a good doctor, who do you ask? Another woman. If you want to
Yes.
know a good school district, who do you ask? Another woman. So
Mhm.
we've got to get out there and make the case for Hillary, speaking to women we know, to people who know us, because that's where we have the credibility. Well, as I
Great.
said, we did that, and we did pretty well in the district we worked.
Mhm.
I never heard of relational campaigning until this year. Turns out that's what I was doing.
I
And,
love that.
and that's what we can all do. Every one of us is on some form of social media.
Right.
You have your podcasts, of course, are wonderful.
Yeah.
Almost everybody I know has either a Facebook account or an Instagram account. So
Sure.
you can overnight reach hundreds of people.
At the very least, people can send emails to their
Absolutely.
friends and family, and we can all be influencers.
Totally right.
So,
That's it.
absolutely. So, I'm going to pivot. You and I, and many people watching or listening to this, are proudly Jewish. And you have been involved with at least a couple of organizations. Yikes, hold on, I have to get the name of it. The founder and co-chair of the Democratic Majority for Israel, as well as Zionists. Talk about what the mission of the groups you've been involved with and the challenges since the brutal terrorist attacks by Hamas on October 7th and the war and the devastation for all people since then.
Well, it's interesting. We started by saying a long time ago when I was coming up as a feminist, if you will, and I found
Yes.
people would say, well, you're Jewish, so of course you're a Zionist, right? You're Jewish, so of course you're for Israel. But feminism, what's that?
Mm,
Oh, I find people will say, well, you're a woman, so of course you're a feminist. But
mm,
Zionist, what's that? So I
mhm,
want to stop and explain I'm a Zionist because I believe in self-determination for the Jewish
mhm,
people, just as I
mhm.
believe in self-determination for other people. Zionism is simply saying that the Jewish people have the right, if you will, certainly the desire to have a ancestral, to go to their ancestral home as other people have done. So that's, I'm a Zionist. What has been most troubling is to watch, and it has really been aggravating this last year, a growing divide between people who define themselves as Zionists and people who say, I'm a progressive.
Mhm.
I believe that, again, self determination is a progressive value. So for me, Zionism is part of being a progressive. It is supporting people in their Zionism, in their right or their will for self determination. But
Yes.
it has been troubling. It is one of the divisions that I think Donald Trump's example has sort of opened the door to. No matter who you're mad at, you can say it. No matter how hateful you feel, it's all right to say it. And we're seeing an increase in anti Semitic attitudes and incidents. You
Yes.
know this 100%, 200%. That is very, very troubling. And so
Yes.
we need.
Talk briefly what the super left has been using. One of the phrases is from the river to the sea. What's wrong with that? What's so troubling? And why don't you explain that?
When we talk about from the river, the people who use it, they're not talking about the Hudson River where I grew up. We're talking about the Jordan River onward to the Mediterranean Sea. That is, in effect, the land of a small piece of which is Israel, the
Hmm.
only country in the world that is a Jewish state, the only country in the world where millions of Jews live. So when people say from the river to the sea, what is going to happen to the millions of Jews who live there?
Mhm.
This is about erasing them.
Yep.
A very troubling act of, it's symbolic violence, but unfortunately, what we have learned, if we ever doubted it, is if you shout at symbolic violence long enough, if you accept the possibility, it will come true.
Yes. And just a reminder, Israel is the key democracy, the country that has a free press that allows gays and lesbians to live safely and equally, gives women's rights and all of the things that we cherish in a democracy. And there's no other country in the Middle East that offers those rights.
Absolutely. Which is why we should be a progressive beacon.
Absolutely. So there is so much more, but I want to pivot to your suffrage collection, which I think is amazing. So I was glad to have been appointed by the governor to be on the centennial celebration of women's suffrage. And so talk about your collection. And first off, you guys should check out her website. But why don't you talk about how you started and what's there, and how is that going to be part of your legacy?
Absolutely. So there I am living in Boston in the 70s. And again, as you heard, I'm in this women's movement, meaning we sort of go out and have meetings and try to raise money so we can talk some more and reach more people and use mimeograph machines because this was. And I'm walking through Faneuil Hall at a time when it was more of a flea market than it is
Okay.
now. And there on one of the trays, some paper, lots of paper. And one of the pieces of paper in this flea market said Suffrage Bazaar. And they were having a bazaar, like a, almost like a junk sale. And they were going to be selling, right? Selling hand-knitted goods, jams and jellies you make and bring. And I looked at them, I know what they're doing. They're doing what I do. They're trying to raise money a little bit at a time so they can write the pamphlet, so they can get out and tell the story for suffrage, for women's suffrage. Oh, wow. So I will say that I think I paid $3.50 for that piece of paper. Suffrage, I'm glad to say, has become more interesting, but boy, the prices have risen.
Yes.
I took it home and we have it framed to this day. And I
Nice.
started looking when we went to used book fairs. If you go to a political item, American political item collectors um, conference, looking how did they tell the story?
Yes.
How do you win? Now, remember, how do women win suffrage? You have to persuade the majority of voters to open the doors to the polling place. And
Mhm.
all the voters you have to persuade are men.
Mhm.
All the voters. So what are the arguments you use to persuade men to open the doors, to share their power? That is not easy.
Right.
And who are these women who were so brave? When you think about, in the 1910, and you're walking up and down the steps of a tenement in New York City, you're wearing more clothes in one day than you or I might wear in a week. I mean, because it was a different costume. You're going up and down the stairs to try to get the women in the house to sign a petition that she wants to vote. You have to explain to her why she should care about voting.
Yes.
You have to explain to members of the House and Senate eventually why they should support women voting. And let me tell you, if they could do that, we can do whatever challenges we face. But I
Yes.
hope people will go to my website, go to Google and type in Ann Lewis suffrage. And you get to this collection because we've had it all digitized and put on the web. And you can see the very pieces of paper they used that said, here's why you should vote. Here's why it matters to you.
And we are going to put the link to your website at the end of this conversation. And the last thing that I want you to talk about before we go to the Fast Five is the ERA, the Equal Rights Amendment, that should have been in the rearview mirror decades ago, but actually the Maryland General Assembly is debating it now Again, it's on the Senate floor. It's been approved by committee, and it's going to be calling on Congress to, oh, come on, give us a break. Let's move this forward again. So talk about the importance of the Equal Rights Amendment, if you would.
I'm going to say, I think right now the most important part about the Equal Rights Amendment for me is that it forces a discussion of where we are and why we haven't gone further.
Mm.
It forces a public debate about the fact that we are still an unequal society.
Mm-hmm.
And why? Why is it that an issue like choice, like women's health care, is such a dividing line in a country that, as we've said, the very people who don't want to go to children's feeding programs will suddenly announce to you that they really love babies. That's why they don't want women to have health care. What is it? And that is not because the ERA is about choice. I'm not trying to make it more difficult. I'm saying that through that prism, through that debate, we can talk about our lives, our roles, how we respect one another, because that is still an issue and we need to address it. So I look forward to the debate. I know you will do it well. We need to pay, because the only way we're going to win this, I should do it that way, is by lots more attention, lots more debate, talking about what the stakes are.
Deep breath. So, Ann Lewis, it's time for the Fast Five. 5 quick questions, 5 quick answers to give folks a little bit more information about you. And since you are one of my sheroes, I'm going to start question 1. Tell me who some of your heroes or sheroes have been.
No surprise, because you just heard me talk about suffrage. And just think how important that has been to our lives. Number 1 hero, Carrie Chapman Catt, who was a political and strategic leader. She could figure out what it would take to get the votes and how to get there. But again, Rosie Schneiderman, who comes to the United States from Ukraine, right? She's not quite 5 feet tall, goes to work in a factory, winds up being a union leader, active in the Women's Trade Union League. So one of the society ladies she meets in the Women's Trade Union League invites her to a Sunday supper at her house, and she meets the husband, Franklin Delano Roosevelt.
Wow.
And Rosie Schneiderman, born in Ukraine, not quite 5 feet tall, becomes a member of the Roosevelt's inner circle. Like they say, she was the only member of the brain trust of the New Deal who had actually ever been in a factory. Continues to be president of the Women's Trade Union League, and says, I think I was born a suffragist, but if I hadn't been, the conditions of working women would have made me so.
Amazing.
And the
That's
third.
Great. Okay, fast. These are Fast 5. Go.
Go ahead.
The third one is
Ida B. Wells. Again, born, as we know, in the South, escapes nearly a lynching, lives in Chicago. When Illinois passes presidential suffrage and sort of limited suffrage, some women didn't know what to do with it. Ida B. Wells knew right away. She organized the Alpha Suffrage Club in the Black wards of Chicago and elected the first Black alderman in Chicago, because she understood that's what politics is about. It's not an end in itself. It's how you get stuff done. Okay. Sorry.
Okay. No, that's all right. You have mentored or inspired so many of us. Tell me something you would tell a young woman thinking about starting a career in politics. One piece of advice you would offer.
I'm going to quote Justice Ginsburg. Ruth Bader Ginsburg said, fight for what you believe in, but do it in ways that make others want to join you.
Love it. Question number 3. What is the best movie or TV show about women in politics?
Oh my goodness. I don't know. I'm sorry. I had to think about that a lot. A movie,
Okay.
TV show. I think there have been movies that I liked better. Give me time. I'd have to come back, and you don't have enough time.
Okay. Question number 4. What's favorite book? Do you have a favorite book, especially by a woman author?
Yeah, favorite books are usually the ones I've just read. but I've just read a couple that I really recommend. One has a terrible title, The Confidant, but it is a life of a woman named Anna Rosenberg, who wound up being a high-ranking official in both the Roosevelt and Truman administrations. Almost never heard of her till I stumbled on this book, and how she did it. And she was, again, Assistant Secretary for Manpower for Harry Truman.
Oh, okay.
Independent, but a great view of the few women who did break through and who did make it and what they learned. So this month, that's my current book. Next month, there'll be another one.
Okay. All right. I should say that I'm reading Liz Cheney's book right now. And man,
Oh, okay. I'm sorry, but I got to remember one more that I did just a biography of Shirley Chisholm.
yep.
Nearly enough about her, how young
Yes.
she was when she ran. It's so again, I read a lot, and I tend to get very excited about the books I'm reading, and then they pile up. But those two for sure in the last 2 months.
Right. I read her Unbought and Unbossed decades ago. So for those who may not know who Shirley Chisholm was African American woman, member of Congress from New York, who was the first woman to run for president, and did it as a serious candidate.
Starts as a Head Start teacher, nursery school teacher. That's the network. That's the organization from which she gets elected to Congress. It's a great story.
Awesome. Ann Lewis, question number 5. Such an icon, such a leader, so many accomplishments. What is your hidden secret superpower? What's a skill or talent you have, something most folks can't do?
Oh my goodness. Then but I think what I do, people could, every other women could do. That's more important to say. Listen to where people are. Think about how to connect with them. Think about how to get them to take that next step. Think about what's most important in their lives so you can do it together. Because we get an election year and we have got to do it.
Yes, yes. Well, Anne, it's been such a joy. I could keep talking to you for just eons, and I'm so grateful for your time and for the example that you have set for me and countless women in politics, in policy, in the nonprofit world, in campaign world, in so many communities. And so bless you, thank you, and it's been great kibitzing with you today.
Thank you.